Welcome to One Symphony, a podcast that explores classical music's relevance in our modern lives. I'm conductor Devin Patrick Hughes, and I'm here to share with you stories and conversations with musicians, composers, and artistic entrepreneurs that aim to unite us into one symphonic world. Active as a composer, concert curator, and arts manager, Dan Visconti is updating the role of the classical musician for the 21st century as he creates connection to communities. For his ongoing initiatives to address social issues through music by reimagining the arts as a form of cultural and civic service, Visconti was awarded a TED Fellowship and delivered a TED Talk at the conference's 13th anniversary. Visconti's musical compositions are rooted in the improvisational energy and maverick spirit of rock, folk music, and other vernacular performance traditions, elements that tend to collide in unexpected ways with classical music. He was described by the Plain Dealer as both mature and youthful, bristling with exhilarating musical ideas and a powerfully crafted lyricism. Commission credits include works written for the Kronos Quartet, Branford Marcellus, Eighth Blackbird, Opera Philadelphia, the Jack Quartet, Alarm Will Sound, Da Capo Chamber Players, members of the Berlin Philharmonic, and guitarist Jason Viau. His music has been recognized with the Rome Prize, Berlin Prize, and awards from the Kusevitsky Foundation at the Library of Congress, Fromm Foundation, Naumburg Foundation, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Following a decade serving in artistic director roles at adventurous chamber group Fifth House Ensemble and career development firm Astral Artists, Visconti now works as an independent manager representing composers and curating some of the world's first audience interactive video game and music events. Dan, it's great to have you on One Symphony. You have been a composer and are known as a composer, but you're more than a composer. You're an innovative creator in bringing new classical music experiences to life. Can you talk about your earliest musical memories and how that influenced your work?
Thanks so much for having me, Devin. I think you're doing some really great stuff on the podcast. And this is such a cool question to go back to the beginning. It's like the composer's superhero origin myth, right? But for me, it didn't start with anything that was fancy or highfalutin. I think my earliest musical memories probably started from playing around with some old pots and pans or this one really small saucepan that my mom had bequeathed to me. But it's a fun spirit that I try to remember because for me, where music composition came from, and at least what I try to keep it as in my later work, is it's really about exploration. It's really about play and a sense of discovery. Those are often elements that we find strangely lacking in a lot of the current classical music space, even though there's such a rich lineage of thinking and vivid music making. Those are qualities that I always strove to preserve in my later compositions, no matter how outwardly complicated or strange they might seem, to keep a certain kind of directness of expression and engagement. Also, along with that comes a urge to help other people find and discover that too, because we're all composers. We're all musicians. We all have the ability to participate in communal music making. That's one of the most magical experiences. And it's always sad to me that not every single human being will ever have the experience of conducting an orchestra or composing a symphony or something, but we can all participate in a way that's just as meaningful according to our own understanding and just our innate human expression. So those are some qualities that led me beyond composition into other areas as well.
So you have some experiences of the Beatles at an early age, and it's my understanding also you didn't like the violin at 5. You also took up the electric guitar pretty quickly. And so what made you stay in the classical music sphere?
That's always a funny reminder. I was a terrible violin student. I think some of that was I was the kind of person who learned the basics of instruments very quickly, but I just didn't have the discipline and the ability to focus to do that difficult work on perfecting scales, to really play at that highly disciplined level. As you well know, being a classical musician is being a special kind of athlete where your batting average needs to be approaching 100% every performance, or it simply doesn't work. So that's something that I just learned a lot about myself. I didn't have that aptitude, but where I did have interest was in how music was put together. I was always getting yelled at for making up slightly different cadential passages to end parts of Mozart, concerti and sonatas, and started to realize that it was actually in that facility of looking at how music can be created that really meant a lot to me. So I transitioned away from being a performer, but I was always really grateful for a lot of experiences, especially things like playing in youth orchestras. That sense of hearing an orchestra up close or from within is really valuable and rare. And I think oftentimes when there's problems for the kind of composers who write stuff down on paper is when we become really disconnected from the folks who sit and have to deal with the consequences of our decisions. So having to wear multiple hats, having to understand what it's like to have to be someone else, what's exciting, what's challenging about it, what's infuriating. Those are all things I was really excited to share. You mentioned the Beatles, and I've always thought that growing up, they're such an endearing band. One of the many reasons is that there's such an ideal balance of experimentation along with directness, with melody. And I think oftentimes in the rhetoric of our current classical music space, we've adopted this weird, untrue idea that those two things are mutually exclusive, that there's either music that's on the cutting edge and experimental, or there's music that is pleasing and beautiful, well constructed. The best work obviously does both. And the ability to do both, it becomes almost an argument for both of those things existing. So that's always been a model to me, is that it's a false conversation you have to choose. That's always been a motivation for me to see if I can bring in some of those elements that I often find missing from the current way that our culture is handling classical music and bring them back. They're not always qualities that were completely absent. As you well know, we used to clap between movements. We used to engage a little bit more. So a lot of unlearning has to happen to get back to that childlike quality of just playing around. And I think that's something really infectious that people respond to. We've fallen into a trap thinking sometimes that the draw is, oh, this is so prestigious, or this is so excellent. When I think the real draw is, we don't completely know what's going to happen. Come help us. We need you. Come figure it out with us. And sense of co-learning and co-discovery, that's very special. And that people in the space, such as you, who are working in orchestras, have a unique ability to engage that, as I know that you've done in a lot of the shows you've created as well.
I would love to hear more about some of your programs, just to name a few of the many things and projects you've been involved in over the past decade or so. You've brought music to incarcerated youth, a kind of recurring program that develops that relationship there to where they can feel like it's their music and giving them empowerment in a prison setting. You've also done a festival of refugees. You've done an opera with Opera Philadelphia project where you're involving the community. So audience members are actually roles and participants in the production. Can you talk about some of these projects in general or more specifically, and which of them you feel could most easily be incorporated into orchestra's current programming?
Thinking both generally and then how that actually translates when the rubber meets the road is where the implementation happens. And there's all kinds of interesting questions that have come up. But for me, just starting in from the general area, there's a lot of different ways that we can think about music intersecting with social impact. There's not just one. There's obviously a lot of people, especially young people that I meet who are studying music now, are really excited about that at a young age rather than it being something new and learned. Because when we look at other art forms or even other forms of music, like in popular music, there's been historically a much more direct invitation to engage. In fact, that's a great thing that music, especially new music, can do, is it can be constructed to do something. So thinking about this, a really big point in my life was when I was in Chicago working with a fantastic chamber group with house ensemble. I was really excited to meet a lot of people in education and in civic practice who were really thinking about this in the arts and theater community, especially. As we all know, there's something about classical music seems to always be a little bit behind some other movement. For example, Impressionism and visual art happens a lot earlier than when you get to Debussy and the French Impressionist composers in music. In the same way, I feel like a lot of these ideas were really developed in experimental theater over 20, 30 years ago in terms of how can we actually turn what used to be passively imbibing something that's prepared to something that's participatory, something where people have a chance to actually address a problem. There's a whole spectrum of that. Michael Road, who is one of my absolute complete mentors and a very inspiring figure. He founded Sojourn Theater. He's also founder of the Center for Civic Practice in the Midwest, which is a really great resource for artists I urge people to check out. Michael articulated a spectrum of practice in the arts in relation to how you are actually engaging communities. So in one sense, what Michael refers to as studio practice is what we typically think of as art. An artist creates something in the studio. Now, that can be a work that's about pretty flowers. It can be a work that's about an important social event, but it's still studio practice if it's just an artist creating from their own fine feelings and putting it out. That's something I think a lot of folks miss. There's a lot of concert works that might be titled after something, but they're actually studio works in nature. It's not that one of these different kinds of ways of engaging is better than the other. And I think a lot of great artists use a combination of all of them, but it's interesting to get specific. So moving along in the middle, there's something that Michael referred to as social practice, in which an artist is responding to what they perceive as a community need. So it's still coming from the artist, but there's a reaching out and attempt to solve a problem. Michael defined civic practice on the farther end as the case in which the work comes itself from the community need. The work of art is in response to solving a problem. The entire work of art is in service of this problem. So that's really interesting because there's different ways of engaging and they're all useful in different situations. So I'll give you one kind of focused example. You mentioned a few projects that I've been privileged to be involved with and learned from a lot of different populations. One of them is you mentioned working with incarcerated youth, which is a really particular focus. And I want to credit founder Fifth House Ensemble, Melissa Nahn, for her vision, as well as Hareen Koshak, who was our cellist and was really our lead teaching artist at Nancy B. Jefferson Special School at Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. Over about 9 or 10 years, we had our program for incarcerated youth go through 3 basic iterations. And I'll share a little bit about what those were and some of the mistakes and learning that we make, at least in my humble opinion. The very first thing that we did with incarcerated youth was a project based around helping them create original poetry and songs that expressed whatever they wanted to share. And of course, that was really helpful for a number of reasons. It helps teach skills like English, writing, comprehension. It helped teach maybe the even larger skill about how to turn your own experience into a work of art, a story that can be useful and impactful for other people. We were involved in concerts that ended up having these young people be able to feature their work for their family, their community, other youth who might have been in a similar situation, need to hear their message. So there were a lot of really exciting things that came from this. But over time, we started to notice certain things, such as a certain kind of overemphasis or focus in subject matter on violence and authority. And we realized over time that a lot of that was coming from us. It wasn't coming from them. It was coming from a very well-meaning kind of mistake that still yields something that's unfortunate and actually nefarious, where we're interacting with them mainly because we know them as incarcerated. And thus we expect them to create art that essentially reflects that. So we wanted to think about opening up the range of interaction and the range of emotions so that we didn't just end up focusing on stories about hard times, how people got here. Because what they need is to be taken out of that. They're in a circumstance where everything in their life is radically limited and focused down almost to one-dimensional point. What they don't need is to have more focus on you are this and this label of this temporary situation they're in to end up becoming their whole identity. So thinking about that, well, we dipped into something that is going to seem really unlikely for any music buffs. We dipped into what's known as graphic score notation, which is still used, but was originated by a lot of very avant-garde composers in the 50s. Composers like Earl Brown, his December 52 is a single piece of paper with some different sized blocks on it. It doesn't use music staff or anything traditional. And there's some very free instructions on how musicians are to interpret that. So we thought about this, and traditionally, this is something that's seen as historical, maybe academic kind of throwback. It seemed like a really ideal thing to use in this situation, because for one thing, it removed the barrier of all this jargon, having to go to a music conservatory. That's really elitist, and people need to have a way of engaging music, connecting with their birthright without the barrier. It's incredibly useful for folks like you or I who might be composing or conducting a notated score, but a lot of people aren't going to have that background, and figuring out how to create a way that they can engage is really important. So number one, it was a useful tool for that, but also because it was abstract, it opened up a range of emotional responses. We would have people create really amazing, beautiful works of art. And sometimes they would have some idea about these colors code for this, or these larger shapes equal more volume or some kind of interpretive key, or sometimes there would be none. And that would lead to incredible variety of interpretation, which often doesn't happen with a very detailed classical score in the same way that it happens in other kinds of musical forms. So there were a lot of beautiful things happening with the second iteration. But the story that I'll highlight that I think really sums it up is we always do emotional checks when we do exercises in these settings. It's really important to be constantly taking the temperature of how people are feeling, especially in a setting where sometimes tensions can get a little bit hot, right? So this one point, we were asking some people to describe how they were feeling with just what color. Simple thing. I'm feeling blue today. Oh, I'm feeling red. Really simple exercise. I don't need to emphasize that this is a really difficult environment where it's not always great to deviate from what's cool or tough to say. And we had one inmate end up saying, today I feel like a rainbow. And immediately everyone else around him said, what are you saying? And he said, normally I feel like I have to be one color, but today I feel like I could be any of the colors. Like I don't feel like I'm limited. And that was a really beautiful moment. And seeing everyone else back off and say, okay, so that's some of what I was really proud about with a second iteration of our work with incarcerated youth, getting beyond some of the obvious and going deeper and thinking really about how can music be addressing a specific need that they have in terms of opening up, in terms of removing that feeling that the main part of their identity is to be incarcerated. The third and final iteration of this long project that I'd love to share about is when we went forward and started incorporating some techniques that come from composer Pauline Oliveros and her deep listening methodology. Pauline is this fantastic composer who is really forward-thinking, and she did all kinds of experiments with sound as itself, including collaboration with trombonist Stuart Dempster, where she found a cistern in a suburb of Seattle that had about a 45-second reverberation delay and recorded some really amazing music there. So she became really interested in this idea I mentioned earlier about music as everyone's birthright. She pioneered a lot of these text scores, among many other things, really interesting recipes that everyone could understand, but were a relatively simple score that would yield something complex and beautiful. Some of her scores look simple, but they're incredibly informed by psychology, such that people just freely sing a pitch, listen in the room, and then sing another pitch. But because of psychology, it layers in a way that always tends to be consonant and pleasing. Pauline created some really beautiful exercises like this that almost in practice are like little musical rituals. The emphasis is on the music being made, but it's just as much on the process and almost the poetic or emotional sense. There was one exercise we were doing in which we had this beautiful Tibetan ringing or singing bowl, and there was a striker for it. And the way this piece of music by Pauline was composed, rather than strike it yourself, one by one, someone goes up, takes the striker, and they gift it to someone else in the room, which is a really beautiful setup. In designing the roles of the game, we design how people will interact based on those parameters. It's really beautiful to see people slow down and think about who they want to give this gift to. And one of the sessions, the most beautiful things that I saw happen is an inmate gave it to one of the guards, who typically don't participate in these activities in any way. It's uncomfortable for me to say, but there's often issues of violence between inmates and guards. So this is a very real issue. I saw that guard hesitate for a second and then participate, hesitate, then participate, leaning forward, striking the guard, and then giving it to someone else to do that. That really changed a lot of things without a specific meeting about the issues. It was poetic and artistic, but it really hit home to me the power of music to create meaningful change in people's lives. Also, it hit home how that doesn't happen by accident. The old thought used to be we put people around music, and just because it's so great and so excellent, it changes them. And if it didn't, or they don't understand it, they must need to study more. It's probably their fault. What I've learned from a lot of this is that it's really on us, those in the know, those that have this experience, their conservatory training, to meet other people where they are and to figure out how to design for them, because that's how you make sure it happens. You design intentionally to use music for a particular effect, and you do it in an adaptable way where you can actually learn from your mistakes in a way that's responsive, just like a conversation. So anyway, those are some of the things I learned in that particular project. But as you mentioned, I've been involved in a lot of different ways of looking at how to have music have that kind of impact and across a spectrum. But that was one where I really learned some of the most.
You talked about how music lowers our barrier for emotional receptivity and expression. Something about adding music to various opposing forces or to difficult conversations makes people more receptive and open to sharing. Aside from just playing music, are there ways to involve the audience? Are there ways to reach out to segments of the community that will not necessarily experience symphonic music? Are there ways to go deeper than just playing the music? Does it have to automatically involve audience participation, or do you think music just by its nature breaks down those barriers?
I want to answer with some nuance as well as any kind of clarity. I think that you hinted something really important, which is that music inherently has a connective ability and it inherently has an interactive ability in a way that's very different. Like you have to engage with a piece of music. You can't just hear it. You have to listen to it. It takes a certain amount of time. You can't glance at it quickly like a work of visual art and just move on and gloss over it. So that there's absolutely those kind of qualities. And I think that I don't want to undermine at all the ability of just the purity of music to engage us. But something else that I've noticed is that there's a particular ritual, whether we state it or not, of your typical traditional classical concert. And for those of us in the know, it's a beautiful thing. There's a purity to it. There's a kind of objectivity as you come in and hear this thing. There's a respect, especially not bothering the performer in a very quiet and sensitive hall. So there's many great things about that. But those of us that are steeped in the tradition and are prepared to understand that experience are probably less than 3% of Americans, at least. I'm not sure if the current figure is worldwide, but I think about the other 97%. Who's going to be creating experiences for them? And also, how would that 3% ever grow larger if we didn't create some kind of gateway for other people to be coming in? So that's what I think a lot about. There's nothing that's wrong about a lot of that presentation. I think it's great. I'm sure that you do too, but it's not the only way of presenting it. As our media becomes more stimulating, as there's things like video games, constant visuals, we really have to up the ante, because I think competition for classical music, it's not the other orchestra down the street. It's not the other hot violinist at Curtis who's studying in another brownstone. I think what it actually is YouTube, it's Netflix, it's things we actually do instead of go out to concerts. So I think that's something that for me has been a guiding light, thinking about how that can be oriented. So to get more directly in your question, what can you do? I think that there's several layers that we can engage, and we can also combine these, but just to list them in a particular way. I think about on stage in terms of who's playing. Is it all professionals? Can you do a collaboration with local artists in the community? Is there a way that you can actually get members of that community who typically be in the audience up on stage as well? There's so many ways to do that. There's inviting a local band, there's creating an actual collaboration with new arrangements that cross-pollinates audiences, that might bring new people to a space or unlock different kinds of presentation. It also might unlock new challenges or skills or needs, such as creating arrangements or having the capacity to work with musicians who have a different kind of background. Those are some really fantastic options. I think it's always easy to discount what happens behind the stage, because you and I are both very heavily involved in planning, and it takes a lot of months and years even to get some of these programs all set. I think about who's involved in deciding what that story is, who gets to be involved in telling that story, because it's all well and good for me to say, I really am interested in some of the racial struggles in America right now, and I really want to make an impact. I think one of the ways that I can make sure I do that authentically is involving the actual people in that community who are affected by those issues, and not just throwing all my good intentions behind that. That's a way to do something that absolutely doesn't help. And I think that's a chance to highlight something that's difficult to say. Whenever we try and do something that's new and cool and interesting and moving the needle, we're going to be worse at it than that traditional thing we're used to. So what will happen is as people try new things, there'll be false starts, and many will look at it and say, we shouldn't be trying to do any of this at all. We should just go back and keep things simple. That's a false conclusion, because what I would expect is that it will take some time to learn and develop and find the really authentic ways to do this, especially for orchestras. A couple other ideas I think about just in terms of interactivity, as far as the kinds of shows too. I think about when I went to see a jazz trio when I was in my teens, the first time I had really been exposed to that music live and not just recordings. And it was shocking to me how different it was from the classical music that I was studying on violin at the time. It wasn't completely written down. So there's this sense of excitement about, oh, what could happen? There was this sense of, I remember the sax player took a great solo, ended on this high note, and the crowd went wild. And then he seemed to take energy from that applause and response. And there was a give and take as if it was a two-way street. And that really excited me, just because that's not always something that you feel in classical music. So those are really important qualities. And I've sought myself as a composer building in opportunities for the musicians to improvise in a way that hopefully is clear and feels comfortable to them, not asking them to just play Donna Lee or some crazy jazz chart that they don't have familiarity with, understanding how to actually accomplish that through trial and error and getting feedback. I think about a lot of those elements that one of the answers simply is that already just in music, there's so much more interactivity that's often outside of the classical music world. It doesn't have to be, but I think bringing that in can happen by collaborating with artists from other genres and making something new that inhabits a kind of middle space that didn't exist before. It was no kind of genre. That's exciting. The final thing I'll mention too, on the kind of more extreme end of what you can do, I've been involved in pioneering some of the first audience interactive video game concerts. And some of that happened as video games developed from really basic things where you shoot or punch people for points into things that were more beautiful and artistic and maybe started to have some more profound meaning as well. I noticed some of that was really cool. It's about this interactive experience. It's about the feeling of actually having agency and that you'll see your input reflected back to you. So that's so exciting. And I think that more and more people are encountering orchestra music through video game soundtracks, which have now started to get Grammy nominations and wins. They're encountering it through nature documentaries. They're not always encountering it by going to the symphony and hearing Patricia. So I think it's also a great way to account for meeting people where they actually are and bringing them in, because it's not just hearing some music that they might love, but it's the association of that music with a particular story, with characters and narrative. And I think that's something that we really need to think about too, is that classical music does its best when telling stories, whether it's literal program music or whether it's simply telling an emotional narrative where each musical choice just leads inexorably to the next in a way that just flows so perfectly. So I think about that, but the idea that people could be at a concert and maybe make a choice about what will happen next in the story, like a choose your own adventure way, either by voting, or I've done concerts where people play individual segments of games and the music reacts in real time. And what's exciting about that is no two shows are ever the same. There's a sense that you don't totally know what could happen. There's a sense that you might want to go to the show again to unlock something profoundly different and unexpected. So those are some really great qualities that I love, but they don't have to be limited to just video games. I think what's most exciting is a lot of these techniques and technologies could be used for anything. Could be used for an education concert that helps open up understanding of a well-known math and makes it more vivid and relevant to today. So what I find is that the more hats that I've worn in the space, it gives me an ability to shift perspectives, which is really important. So I'm always trying to acquire those different perspectives. That's a little bit about interactivity and some of the ways that I could see it playing out.
You talked about how taking on service is what gives life meaning. How do we become ambassadors or civic catalysts?
That's a really exciting question. I think it's one that a lot of people are happily really interested in. I'm someone who's worked in the intersection of social services and music, and I am obviously extremely interested in pushing farther and farther along those lines. But I also want to back up, because not everyone is equipped to do some of the things that I discussed, or at least right now. Maybe I'll inspire some people to go in and do some of the learning and training that builds that capacity. But I think it's really important that people understand that you don't have to be doing some kind of interactive video game show or something of that nature, or working with incarcerated youth to be successfully incorporating some ways of thinking this way. So the first thing I would say, just to back it up, is that any kind of musical event is created for someone. And this is really fundamental, but I want to emphasize it because I think it's a way in, especially for young people who want to start incorporating this now rather than wait until they have the kind of context to make other things happen. So often we have this weird idea that we're picking what we perform. It's really about our own fine feeling or something totally disconnected from the occasion. And it's really about custom making something in the same way that you would lovingly make a pot of soup for your family or something of that nature, but making something just for them that they would truly enjoy, making it with love so that it shows. That's something that we can always do in any kind of way. So one great thing is, I think, starting that, thinking about how we take responsibility for the concert experience. A big shift that a lot of us are starting to realize is we used to think that our job as musicians was we prepare really well, we hide all that preparation, and we just all encapsulate in this one slick moment that we step on stage and we do a perfect performance when we're dressed very formally, and then we leave. But I think more and more people want to know what's going on in the background. What's it like to be a musician? And also more and more, we have to take responsibility for the total concert experience. For example, it doesn't matter how fantastic your concert series is if people are constantly frustrated by parking. It's a very interesting study with the Minnesota Orchestra about 15 years ago. That was the most important factor in people not renewing subscriptions. It had nothing to do with the programming, nothing to do with the prices even. At first it seems, wow, how silly, but that's reality. So I think we need to think about gradually taking on more and more responsibility. Maybe we can't directly affect the parking garage right now, but I think a lot of us go into this when we're younger thinking that, oh, it's all about what I do on stage. And I think more we have to think about, how do we welcome people into the space? What did they do before? What do we want them to do? Do we want them to interact and socialize? And how do we set things up to encourage that rather than them sitting down in an isolated way and ruffling through a program? What if we didn't give them programs? Could that be something? Might that be a problem? How could we test it? Could there be a small event that we could do that would develop learning towards this? So prototyping is one thing that I'll recommend. Comes from the idea of design thinking. It's really important. When you have an idea, rather than hem and haw about it for hours and hours, see if you can build it or a small version of it out of duct tape and cardboard as quickly as you can. See if it actually works. Do all the worst things, try all the things most likely to fail. That's actually the way that you figure out what will really work on a refined level. That's a principle that anyone can use. And especially to speak to some younger people that are coming into this, so that are thinking, how can I actually do this myself? I would really think about designing events that are linked to the venue you're playing in, that really take the community into account and really try to involve that community as much as possible in the design of the show, in the programming of what gets played, possibly on the stage. As much as we can draw from those as appropriate, those different elements help create more meaningful connections in the community. It makes possible those larger kinds of like really specific social service interactions. Always happy to speak about those kind of more complex things, but I really want to bring it back because I think what's so great about this attitude is that you don't have to be working with incarcerated youth in order to be engaging the community and moving society forward. By the nature of having a conversation, you will be affected. Like, you can't actually be open to this without being affected by it. I think that's a great thing, is that by involving other people, you get led to places you might not have gone if you just started from your own fine feelings and didn't let anyone else in. So those are some general principles that I would really emphasize that I think are incredibly helpful. One more thing I might just share as an example is that there's a fantastic happening in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, about 10 years ago. There's a fantastic story I'd like to share. And this comes from my friend Michael Rode, who founded Sojourn Theater and the Center for Civic Practice. This was a project that he was involved in called Islands of Milwaukee. And it started because they were doing basically a series of interviews with some elderly folks who lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, essentially from the same process. They were creating a theater work, and they were just interviewing people and performing short pieces just to learn more about them and what they might like, what might actually be important to them. So they didn't expect to do this, but what they found out through actually being open, there were a lot of older people who hadn't left their city block in years, sometimes up to 5 years. And it was really crazy. Why? The reason was that there were these walk signals that were too short. So it was impossible for them to safely cross the street. What a different kind of musician or artist might have said is, oh, well, not my problem. But Michael said, this is the whole topic of what we're doing. We found it. So they staged this series of crossings of the 10 most dangerous intersections in Milwaukee. They crafted this amazing float that looked like this big crazy boat of all the great things that art can do that are so profound. It's good at creating a spectacle, right? So people would say, what's going on? Like, why are you crossing the street? And they would tell them, and people would say, I didn't know that. That makes me mad. Can I walk with you too? Can I cross with you? So this group would get larger. And then as it got larger, the local news had to cover it because they couldn't ignore it anymore. And then before you know it, you had city councilmen coming on, and a large amount of those intersections were changed later that year. I've heard so many people say in a scoffing kind of way, art and music, it's not like it can change the world or change laws. It absolutely can if deployed with intent. So that's an example of what can really happen, but it didn't start from a highfalutin social project. It started from just listening. So that's why I'm backing up, because that's the starting point that yields all these other wonderful things. And I think if we think about that more, that's something I'm always trying to push myself to do a better job. And I'm always impressed and surprised how it unlocks just deeper and deeper relationships.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit. In addition to being clearly an arts collaborator, consultant, guru, entrepreneur, you happen to be a composer too. I'd love to talk about the great American tradition or kind of adventure of the road trip. And speaking of where worlds and music genres collide, all of us can probably remember whether it's making a mixed cassette tape or popping a CD in, listening to the radio, planning a road trip and embarking into the West or the Midwest or the South or the Southwest, wherever it may be, in the amazing landscapes that happen to be in this country, and putting music to that. And you've done that with Lonesome Roads. I would love for you to talk about the conception of that album, particularly a piece called Low Country Haze, just incredibly inspiring, stirring, soul searching, and everything one would need for a successful road trip.
Thanks so much. It's funny you mentioned the idea of the road trip being uniquely American, because obviously one can road trip anywhere, but there's something about the vastness and diversity of this country. The ability just to take off and see what there is to be seen were really important emotional touch points for me in that piece. That whole disc was really a treat to record. It was recorded with Warszawski piano trio, as well as a good amount of colleagues from the Berlin Philharmonic. Those were some of the collaborators when I was younger, where honestly, I did not deserve to have musicians of that level working with me. They treated me honestly way better than they had any right to, given that I was just some young bumpkin from the Midwest. It taught me a lot about what you can get out of something if you treat things with respect. I've always been so grateful for those performances. I want to say that it was a thrill creating that recording of Low Country Haze. I was originally creating an orchestra piece for David L. Miller and One Symphony, and was looking at celebrating the Hudson and the anniversary of Henry Hudson's explorations. I'm really interested in sound and in how sound can affect us outside of music, the kind of sounds that might not be musical that everyone can relate to. I was thinking a lot about what it must have been like for a lot of the Europeans who came to this continent for the first time, just absolutely in awe of a lot of the sounds they heard. And there's a lot of journals from explorers that simply talk about the musical nature of this and like the different kinds of birds, that the new insects. One even described it as like having a second childhood. There's frankly often so many really upsetting, unsavory things related to Europeans and their exploration of the Americas. This was an element that I really was excited about that had been lost, that I wanted to share. So in creating this piece, I was really imagining Georgia and the Carolinas, but that sense of wonder, that sense of hearing that with new ears for the first time, where they're coming from another culture, whether as a young child. I really wanted to create a piece of music that seemingly started from non-musical sounds Something that happens in a few of my pieces is they often start a complete question mark of just being dropped into something that almost doesn't feel like a piece of music, or maybe leaves you with a feeling of disorientation or questioning. For me, a lot of the process of my musical development is gradually answering that question or gradually making good on that promise. The feeling of things coming together, of uncertainty yielding to something more solid and flowing and clear is a really powerful feeling. And it's also just, to me, honest in the sense that it follows the exact process of my own mind, forming those thoughts and coalescing them together. More and more, I'm striving to have my process of composition have the same kind of honesty and straightforwardness of just a natural thought process rather than a feeling of chiseling and construction and kind of more artifice. This piece really expands and develops from there. It was really interesting to just play with the sounds of reverberant, beautiful kind of characteristics, as well as a certain kind of harmony that's inspired by a lot of Southern hymnals, things like that. So it was really an exciting chance to bring together a lot of different influences into something that was a really short kind of calling card piece. So that's one that's been done a lot. And I should mention that one of the fun things about that piece is it ends with everyone playing water glasses. This is like a little anecdote, but if you want to know what it's like to be a composer, I think it's a marriage of the artistic and the frou-frou and the really practical, because things have to work. There's a bunch of pieces that involve things like tuned water glasses to specific pitches that are in the canon. A lot of them are more in chamber music because it's really hard to do that in orchestra. It's also difficult when liquid evaporates and the pitch changes. Actually, in this particular piece, the way it works is that I wanted this really dense band of sound that was hazy and indistinct, like the opening of the piece, but in a completely different way, in a way that felt like we've been through something and now it's changed rather than we're just back at the start. So it actually works to have everybody playing unspecific pitch or untuned water glass that creates an indeterminate tone cluster that works with the notated tonal music. So it's a very interesting effect to hear that cloud sound take over, but it was a great moment of finding something that worked artistically that also is very easy to pull off. So there's never problems with trying to keep the glasses tuned in low country haze with everyone else appreciates. It was really thrilling to get to explore some of these ideas, both as a composer as well as working on other projects too.
You talk about the artistic side of composing versus the practicality of it all. I'm also curious about when a composer gets that opportunity to create something for a soloist or for somebody who plays an instrument that they actually play. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Living Language, which is a piece that you wrote for a great classical guitarist, Jason Vio, who's also a former guest and friend of One Symphony. I would just love to hear how you had that interaction, him being a classical guitarist, you being an electric guitarist, and did you incorporate any elements from either and how that collaboration was inspired?
Jason's a wonderful collaborator, which is a distinct and additional skill to being a great musician. So I really want to give him props for that. He's been wonderfully supportive. None of this would have happened without him and his close interaction and championship. So the first thing is finding a really true and great human being. Some of those first discussions we had were about that influence because, as you can tell from talking with me, I'm really interested in bringing in non-classical elements, but into classical music. I don't want to switch genres. I want to see more of those in the music that I love. Talking with Jason, we explored the idea of maybe doing something for an electric guitar. Ultimately, what we came down is it would be more effective to write something for his classical nylon string instrument that used qualities like string bending, tapping, and other kinds of effects into it. One thing I found from being a guitarist myself is that the electric guitar is about as different from the classical guitar as an oboe is from a flute. They're truly different. There's different sized fretboards, that there's different curvature of the neck. They're almost like different instruments. So for a Grammy-winning soloist who's at the top of his career, he would really have to dedicate a big chunk of time putting aside just working on that. keeping that his fingers, he'd have to cut his nails. So it became clear that this isn't practical. That's fun because that's the stage of design before we work on eighth notes, figuring out what are we doing and why, and what's our basic approach? Do we have a strategy that's going to work? Ultimately, I'm glad we did that because sometimes the first choice is not always the best in creativity. Sometimes it's about going through the discomfort and pushing yourself to wait until you keep exhausting options. If we would have done that, it would have been obvious, but maybe more conventional. I would have missed the chance to figure out how to actually translate a lot of sounds and techniques to his classical instrument. So to me, that's where a lot of the fun came in the concerto living language. And there's also an earlier solo piece that I wrote Jason called The Devil's Strum, which is based on that old blues crossroads myth of selling your soul to the devil that Robert Johnson and countless others immortalized. That's a piece that starts with the guitar completely mistuned into this terribly dissonant chord featuring the tritone, and woven into the composition over the course of the piece, Jason gradually adjusts the tuning pegs and brings the guitar up. So it's really about this idea of the moment of magic being when the devil tunes the guitar and that kind of locks it in. So I've always been interested in bringing ideas from other sources, but we got to work with the actual realities and the mechanisms of the artists we're dealing with. So some of that too, I had to work with Jason doing string bends that come from really blues and rock playing. And there's much less capacity to do things like that. So figuring out how much can you do? Do we need to detune the strings by a half step? So that was really great. I might summarize it by saying I found out that a good collaboration, at least from a composer with a performer, like a relay race, because the composer has no power at the start. The performer or the organization has the ability to commission. And there's a reason it's really hard to get a commission, is that it's a big commitment. As soon as you hand that baton off, the composer runs away. I'm sure you've experienced this on some level, Devin. We're composers, we're awful. Where's the composer? Are they on time? Are they working on the piece? Did they go to the Bahamas? You don't know. It's very frightening. Finally, the composer comes back and hopefully delivers the baton on time. At that point, there's nothing that I can do. I've had bad collaborations. This was not Jason, where I sat from the audience and saw someone on stage glare at me and wantonly play something completely not what I wrote, as if to say, there's nothing you can do to stop me at this point. And that's true. So I think it's really worth highlighting the shifting power dynamic of the commissioning collaborative relationship, because it looks like a very equal thing and it's not equal at all times. One of the ways that we can be gracious collaborators is recognizing when we hold the baton, when we have the power, is when it's most important to be gracious and to be reaching out, to be giving updates. So that's something that I learned a lot about working with Jason, but it was really fantastic to do that and play with several orchestras now. And we're working on trying to make a recording come out so that other people can get to hear Jason's amazing wizardry.
In the spirit of collaboration, Dan, I really look forward to collaborating with you and how our paths continue to cross. And thank you so much for joining me today on One Symphony.
Thanks so much for having me, Devin. This is really wonderful. I love the podcast you're building and some of the great conversations you've had so far. And I really appreciate your own adventurousness and really thinking about how change could be coming to this exciting field. So I look forward to seeing you around.
Thank you for joining us on One Symphony. Thanks to Dan Visconti for sharing his music and wealth of knowledge. You can find more info and connect with Dan at www.danvisconti.com. Musical selections on this episode today include Music Box, River Silver, Fifth House Ensemble, December 1952 by Earl Brown, David Tudor, Deep Listening by Ione, Pauline Oliveros, Stuart Dempster, and Panayotis, Low Country Haze for Chamber Orchestra, Sharon Ensemble Berlin, Drift of Rainbows, Humble Pie, composed by Dan Visconti. You can always find more info at onesymphony.org, including a virtual tip jar if you'd like to support the show. Please feel free to rate, review, or share the show. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the music.